We see also in the past that that states of emergency that were prolonged paved the way even for totalitarian regimes. So, anytime you mention the Nazis, people tend to sort of freak out. So let me just say in advance, I'm not comparing either the current or the previous administration to the Nazis by mentioning this historical example. I mention it only to show that that the prolonged invocation of a state of emergency can, under certain social conditions, lead in a totalitarian direction. The Nazis governed for virtually the entirety of their existence under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed for the suspension of German laws during a time of emergency. People forget that Hitler was democratically elected. So how did this democratically elected chancellor in the late Weimar Republic assume power to the point where he could become the dictator of a totalitarian regime? Well, one of the legal mechanisms that paved the way for that was this invoking of a state of emergency. And the Nazis also used the language of public health to advance their agenda as well. If you look at the Nazi propaganda of the 1930s, you see that the Jews and other quote-unquote undesirables were often characterized and vilified and dehumanized as vectors of disease. They were dirty. They were carrying, infectious agents that were going to infect the rest of the population.
We live in an era of censorship and disinformation, and it can be really hard to know what's true and what's false in this information climate. To get honest information and insights you can trust, join us on Epoch TV. You can sign up for your 14-day free trial at ept.ms/freetrialjan. That's ept.ms/freetrialjan.
There were subtle shifts in German medicine that happened long before the Nazis came to power that made German medicine, German public health, more prone to get on board with the Nazis' disordered social program. So starting around the early 1920s, there was the eugenics movement, which was imported from the United States and Great Britain. And so that would be another thing for our viewers to study the eugenics movement, not in Germany, which everyone knows about, but in the United States, that resulted in the involuntary sterilization of 65,000 Americans in a majority of 34, I think, states had laws permitting this. The infamous Supreme Court case of Buck v. Bell, which relied on reasoning from the Jacobson case that allowed for involuntary vaccination in 1905 during a smallpox epidemic. This 1927 case of Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state of Virginia, allowing them to involuntarily sterilize this young woman, Carrie Buck, who was diagnosed with congenital feeble-mindedness, which was a loose category back then as it is now. The opinion was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., very famous American jurist. He said the principle that allows for forced vaccination is, quote, wide enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And then the infamous line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, right? So there was this social program that was tied to medicine and public health of trying to improve the stock by controlled breeding. It resulted in involuntary sterilization of quote-unquote defective, mentally and physically defective people and poor people and minorities disproportionately represented in the U.S. Well, Germany was influenced by this, but they took it a step further. They took it in the direction not just of involuntary sterilization, but of outright non-voluntary euthanasia. There was a book published by a psychiatrist and a lawyer, Hoch and Bidding, in 1922 on the destruction of the German word was Lebensunwürdiges Leben, life unworthy of life, where they advocated that disabled individuals should be allowed to be euthanized by the state, with or without their consent or their guardian's consent. And the German medical community embraced this. Why did they embrace it? Well, there was a subtle shift away from a traditional Hippocratic ethic, where German physicians said, my responsibility is to the sick patient in front of me, the vulnerable person who, because of an illness, requires my help, and I need to do everything in my power to try to heal them and to try to minimize any harms to them. That's traditional Hippocratic medicine. Physicians became convinced, starting in the 1920s, that their responsibility was not to the sick individual patient, but to the health of the social organism as a whole. So there was this metaphor of the German people, the Volk, as being healthy or sick as a whole. This kind of social health became the aim of medicine. So if you have a social organism that has a quote-unquote cancer on it, well, what does a doctor do with a cancer? He carves it out in order to make the whole better. Well, certain people, certain individuals in society started being characterized as a cancer on the body politic, or a drain on, the social or economic or health resources of the whole. That was a subtle shift that occurred long before the Nazis came to power. And because doctors had begun to see themselves not as agents of the health of the sick patient, but as agents of the health of the social organism, when the state's social program became misdirected and disordered, physicians went along with it very readily and embraced it. So the first people who were gassed in Nazi Germany were not Jews or other ethnic minorities in concentration camps. They were mentally disabled patients in psychiatric hospitals in Germany. That's where the first gas chambers were located, under the T4 euthanasia program. And physicians were signing off on and endorsing every one of those deaths. 45% of physicians joined the Nazi Party, even though it was not a requirement to be in the profession. It might help you to advance in academic medicine or whatever. We can compare that to only 10% of teachers in Germany who joined the Nazi Party. So what happened to German medicine, which was not backwards and barbaric? German medicine in the early 20th century was considered the best in the world, and German medical schools and medical institutions were considered the most advanced in the world. So Germany was a leader in medicine and public health prior to the Nazis coming to power. What was it about the medical and public health system that started to veer off course? And is there a temptation in other societies to start moving in that direction? If you want to see the ultimate consequences of where that goes, study what happened to Germany in the early 20th century.